So this is so great to be with marketers. I feel like I'm with my people. Like we've closed the doors now, and like kind of the whole rest of the world is out there, and we're in here. So welcome everybody. For those of you who were not in the last session, or those of you who don't know me, you will. My name is Leslie Talbot. I am the Vice President of Consulting for Content on Eric Peterson's team. So my team has the incredibly fun job of being able to help you create all of your messages and then take all those messages and turn them into assets like ebooks and playbooks and infographics and presentations and videos and anything else that you can think of to use your assets. There's two things that you need to know about me before we start. Thing number one is that I am the only thing standing between you and the cocktail hour. So I'm going to do my best to make this presentation as fun and engaging as possible so that you'll forget that I'm standing between you and the bar. The second thing that you need to know about me right off the bat is that I am an incredibly clumsy person. And there is a taped thing, like right here, that goes across the floor. And I will, at some point, probably trip over it. So I'm just preparing you right now so that you know. And when I do trip and fall on my face, you have my permission to point and laugh because I'm clumsy and I deserve it. Okay. So how many people, just out of curiosity, how many people here were at the Monday session with Dr. Tormala and Tim? Okay, good. So you heard a lot of stuff about research and brain science and survey results and other kinds of things. And what you're going to hear in this session, or what I'm going to attempt to do in this session, is to try to pull a little bit of this down into your practical experience so that you can learn how you can take some of that same research and that same science and transform it into the content that you create for your customers and for your salespeople every single day. And I'm assuming everybody also saw Tim Reister's keynote today. I have to confess, I knew what the subject matter of the keynote was going to be because he told me about it, but I wasn't quite sure how he was going to pull it off from a costume perspective. And I was expecting the Gene Kelly trench coat. I was not expecting the yellow slicker and the hat. So that was a nice little surprise for me. But I also now have like the theme to Singing in the Rain like running through my head in an endless loop. I don't know about you guys. But you know, I was sitting there and I was watching Tim and I was listening to Tim talk about Gene Kelly, and I came out of that keynote with Gene Kelly on the brain, but I also came out of that keynote with 3 other names on the brain as well. And let's see if you can tell me what they all have in common. Any thoughts? Sid Charisse, exactly. Mitzi Gaynor. And not Talbot, but Leslie Caron, exactly. So, Sid Charisse, Leslie Caron, and Mitzi Gaynor. Here's the thing about Gene Kelly. Gene Kelly was an amazing performer. Gene Kelly was incredibly talented. Gene Kelly was truly a triple threat. But Gene Kelly was not strictly a solo performer. And in fact, some of Gene Kelly's best, most memorable, and most intricate work was performed with a partner. Sid Charisse, Leslie Caron, and Mitzi Gaynor were just 3 of those partners. And here's the thing about these 3 performers. They are also, and were also, incredible performers. They were triple threats in their own right. They did everything Gene Kelly did, with one critical difference. They had to do it backward and in high heels. So if you were to apply this analogy forward to the world of sales and marketing, as marketers, and I'm putting myself in your tribe here, as marketers, we are forced too often to do so much of our own work backward and in high heels. While our salespeople are out there being triple threats, we are working backwards because we so often have to come up with the messages before we actually talk to the customer, and we are handicapped by the high heels of not being able to see the customer's reaction and react back to them in real time, right? The good news in this is that you can take those same things, those same techniques that salespeople use to have effective face-to-face conversations with your customers, and you can apply those concepts to the content that you create for your customers as well, to support your own conversations. Because make no mistake, if you take nothing else from this presentation today, as marketers, you too are in a conversation with your customer. Every time they engage with your website, every time you send a campaign, every time they click on an asset, you are engaging in a conversation with those customers. So let's talk a little bit about how you can make those conversations just as effective as the face-to-face sales conversations. But because we're corporate visions and we like number plays, I am going to start with a number play. 51%, 83%, and 50%. What do these numbers mean? According to a survey by Demand Gen Reports, 51% of B2B buyers say that they rely more on content today to make buying decisions than they did in 2015. And Demand Gen Reports ran that same survey. They ran that same survey in 2015, and that number was 42% higher than 2014. So what does that mean? It means that the amount and the dependence on content by buyers is increasing exponentially every year. At the same time, according to that same survey, 83% of those same B2B buyers say that they are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of content that's out there today. Not only that, but according to a very sad survey by Forrester Research, 50% of B2B buyers say that the content that they get from their vendors is mostly worthless. Ouch. That is probably why, even though there is a well-known statistics out there that says buyers are as much as 60% of the way through the sales process before they ever engage with a salesperson, we all know how many qualified leads end up in no decision? 60%. 60%. Okay? All right. So what's going on here? Why is this happening? So some people will say that this is a sales and marketing alignment problem, right? And that what you need to do is you need to coordinate campaigns and activities more tightly across sales and marketing, and everything will be okay. And what you're going to hear from me is that, yeah, it's great to align in sales and marketing, and if you've done that or if you've made progress toward doing that, that's awesome, and you will probably see a good uptick in conversions as a result of that. But what you're also hearing from me, and what you're going to hear from me, is that sales and marketing alignment in and of itself is not enough. And why is that? That is because in too many organizations, sales and marketing alignment ends up meaning being coordinating activities across sales and marketing according to what your definition of your sales process is, right? Remember the sales funnel, this whole idea of the concept of the sales funnel? It's a very, very simple concept, right? The buyer enters at the top of the funnel. They go through a series of gated marketing steps. There's a handoff to sales, and then they emerge at the bottom of the funnel with your shiny solution in their hands. Yay, right? Very simple. Sales funnel, very logical, very organized, very choreographed, very wonderful, and it was invented in 1899. The sales funnel was invented in 1899 for a low information world. And as you all know, the world today is very different. That funnel has shattered. And the funnel has shattered because the buyer is entering the funnel at any and every stage. And all of that content that the marketers are creating in response to these supposed buyer demands is just creating more waypoints for the buyer to navigate around. So to be successful in B2B sales and marketing today, you need to think outside the funnel, right? Not only that, but your buyer is not in it alone anymore, right? Research from Corporate Executive Board says that there is now an average of 5.4 decision makers for every major B2B buying decision. And do you ever wonder who that 4/10 of a person is? I always envision this like really angry little man in an office somewhere who swoops down at the last minute to kill your deal, right? But the thing is that all of these buyers too are navigating their own buying processes, often independent of what everybody else in the buying committee is doing. So even though there's a statistic that says that one of these buyers might be 60% of the way through the buying process before they engage with a salesperson, you still got 4.4 other buyers that you've got to bring along. And if only one of them is only 10% of the way through the buying process, that means that they're all only 10% of the way through the buying process. And you're all looking at me right now like, okay, Leslie, I'm a marketer. It was my understanding there would be no math. But so here's another way to look at it. At the end of the day, what you're looking to do, and you know this from corporate visions, is to get your prospect to change. You want them to do something different, whether it's to click on a link, whether it's to respond to an offer, whether it is to pick up the phone and call a salesperson. You want to shake them out of their inertia, shake them out of their status quo, and get them to do something different. How hard is it to get your buyers to do something different today? Quick show of hands. How many people in this room made a New Year's resolution for 2016? How many people have kept that New Year's resolution? All the hands go down. Okay, how many people didn't even bother making a New Year's resolution because you knew you weren't going to keep it anyway? Yeah, me too. Me too. Okay, so that's you. Consider how difficult it is for you to change yourself, to change your own behavior. And then ask the question, how much more difficult it is for you to get a total stranger to change, right? All right, so what have we learned so far? So we have learned that creating more content is not the answer. We have learned that simple alignment, sales and marketing is not the answer, right? And why is it not the answer? Because the buyer's in control of their own journey. And we have learned that simply messaging a lot of content to individual personas is not the answer because there's too many buyers on too many decisions for that to be a sustainable course. Now notice, I am not telling you that you shouldn't do any of this stuff, but what I'm telling you is that doing all of this stuff independently is not enough anymore. So what do you need to do? You need to find a simple, underlying, unifying principle to pull all of these activities together. And that underlying, unifying principle is science. It's by understanding science, understanding the way human beings frame value and make decisions. You understand the science, you're going to start to be able to crack the code of customer behavior. And the best part about the science is that it doesn't matter whether you're in sales or whether you're in marketing because the science doesn't care. It's universal, right? Okay, so to understand a little bit more about science, I'm gonna touch on something that Jennifer Acker talked about today. For those of you who've been through power messaging, power positioning, this is kind of Corporate Visions 101, but to understand the science, you need to understand a couple of core things about the way the human brain works, and I'll shorthand this for you. For our purposes, think about the fact that there are two sides of the brain that you really need to deal with. The old brain, which is responsible for survival, and the front part of the brain, or what we call the new brain, which is responsible for logic and analysis. And which part of the brain do you think is in control of the buying decisions? Yeah, exactly. The old brain is where buying decisions are made. The old brain uses two things to filter how it makes these decisions. The first filter that it uses is emotion. First filter that it uses is emotion, is what we call gut instinct. It's actually taking place in the lower part of your brain. And one of the best ways you heard today from Jennifer Acker to engage a prospect's emotion is through a story. By putting the buyer's experience into and putting your capabilities into a narrative context to make it understandable and resonant with the old brain. And then the second way that you engage the old brain is through novelty, through giving the old brain something new to think about, something new to look at. The old brain is constantly on the lookout for anomalies in the environment. That's how it triggers the survival instinct. So if you can create a story that is based in emotion and based on novelty or on differentiation, you're going to be able to engage that old brain. But not just any story. It's got to be a story that is unique to you. So before you start to engage and start to have this conversation with your customers, ask yourself this question: what is the story that I am uniquely qualified to tell? And start with that. Start with what's different about you. Okay. So you've got your story. That's great. All you got to do is just go out and find a story and tell it, right? How easy is that? Once again, the answer is science. If you can ground your story in what we call the 3 C's of effective storytelling, you're going to be well on your way to having these persuasive sales conversations. So, what are the 3 C's? Context, contrast, concrete. Remember these 3 C's. We'll talk about this. There's going to be a quiz at the end. All right, let's take a look at each one of these individually. We'll talk about them. I'll share some of the research around them, and then we can take some questions. So let's look at the first C, which is context. To tell an effective story, you have to put it in the context of the buyer's experience. You have to disrupt that experience by putting it into that concept as well. And one of the best ways to disrupt a buyer's experience is through something called insights. Is everyone here familiar with the concept of insight selling? Is anybody not familiar with the concept of insight selling? So we talk a lot about insight selling at Corporate Visions. We're huge proponents of insight selling. Insight selling is an amazing thing. But insight selling is one of those things that's really, really great in theory and is often horrifically bungled in execution. And why is it bungled in execution? Because too many organizations take this idea of insights and start bombarding their customers with percentages and facts and statistics and numbers and dollar signs and whatever else so that the buyer gets overwhelmed, right? Without any context, there is no insight. So what you're going to hear from Corporate Visions is that a fact without a story is simply a data point. A fact with a story is what an insight is. Does that make sense to everybody? So what's the best way to share insights with your customers? So we did some research to find this out. Did Tim talk about the vitamin D study on Monday? Okay, I'll go through this really quickly for the folks who did not hear this presentation. We divided test subjects into a couple of different groups, and the idea and the goal of the session was to, number one, heighten their awareness around the risks of vitamin D deficiency, and to motivate them to do something else, something different with their own vitamin D intake. So how did they do that? They did that by sharing insights. So the first group received the information about vitamin D and then had to respond to a series of diagnostic questions following receiving the information. The second group had the diagnostic questions issued to them first, and then they got the information to follow that up. And then the third group only got the information. So for those of you who were at the survey, at the session on Monday, what were the results? What were the survey results? It was the insights first, ended up being the most effective approach. So the prospects who received the insights first were more motivated, were more aware of the risks of vitamin D deficiency, and they were more motivated to do something about it. So very simple again. So the answer is that if you want to share insights with your customers, one of the best way to do that is to share information with them and then follow that with diagnostic questions. But we're marketers. We are dancing backward in high heels. How in the world do we go out and ask diagnostic questions to all of the people who are consuming all of our content? We are in a very fortunate time as marketers right now because one of the new assets and one of the new tools that we have at our disposal is big data and interactive content. And you can pair interactive content with insight selling in an entirely new way that's going to actually help you move the needle on some of these marketing conversations that you have. So things like clickable infographics, assessments, quizzes, calculators, surveys, anything that you can do to engage your prospect. So imagine, for example, you want to test out a new feature, you want to test out an insight. Imagine putting together an interactive infographic where you present a statistic, have your prospect click on it and answer a true or false question. And then you can then take that information and use that information to send them down a specific path based on what their responses to all those questions are. So all of a sudden, as a marketer, you are finally having conversations with your customers in real time. And not only that, but you actually have the data that you're collecting in the background that's going to help you further tailor that experience to whatever journey that buyer is on. How many people are actually making effective use of interactive content right now? Okay, so not a lot of people. It's a fascinating thing, and it's definitely taking hold in the world of marketing. And in fact, if you take a look at a survey from the Content Marketing Institute, you'll see that in 2016, 75% of B2B marketers said that they were going to increase their use of interactive content this year. So if you're not using interactive content now, take a look, start to look into it, and start to understand how you can use it to apply it to share those insights with your customers. And here's a little clue for you as well. You heard from when Eric Nitschke was presenting before. The more disruptive the insight, the more effective that marketing conversation is going to be. Which brings us to our second C, which is contrast. Okay, there's some science behind this one too. Contrast lies in the value between competing alternatives. Value lies in the contrast between competing alternatives, between the status quo and the future state. 2002, this will be familiar to some of you who have been through power messaging. In 2002, Daniel Kahneman is the author of a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for his work on a concept called prospect theory. And what Kahneman proved through all of his experiments with his colleagues was that people are more likely to take action to move away from a perceived loss than they are to move toward a perceived gain. And we can actually graph this. So let's say that the horizontal axis here represents losses and gains. And then the vertical axis represents the psychological value that Kahneman's subjects assigned to losses and gains. Now, in a traditional graph, what you would probably expect is that the psychological value they ascribe to a loss or gain would increase exponentially with the greater the gain. So in other words, you would expect to see a line that goes straight up and down. But that wasn't what Kahneman found. What Kahneman actually found in his experiments is that there's a leveling off. Eventually, the psychological value that subjects assigned to the gains actually levels off at a certain point. There's a law of diminishing returns that kick in. There's only so much value that they place on gain so much. So what does this mean for you as a content marketer or as a marketer? Well, imagine that your prospect engages with you in some form. They click on a link or you send a campaign. When your campaign hits them, they might think that they're holding their own. They might think that they're doing okay. They might think that their status quo is, it's not ideal. There's things that they're doing right. There's things that they could probably do better, but they're pretty much holding their own. So if you present them with content that simply talks about your benefits and how great your solution is and how well they're going to do after they work with you, then they're going to see some value in that. But they're not going to see enough value to want to change, to want to do anything differently. So what you need to do and what your task is as a marketer is to get them to understand that they're not doing as well as they thought they were, that maybe they're actually down here. And if they're down here, then all of a sudden, they're going to see much more value in making a change because they're going from a point where they thought they were worse to a point where they're going to be better. Does that make sense to everybody so far? Okay. So how do you build that contrast into your content? We've got a study for this one, too, that you might have heard about. Okay. We presented to our prospects a series, some marketing messages that put products' features into a risks and benefits context. So the first thing that the prospects saw was a message with just the benefits. Then they saw a message that had the risks and the benefits, but they were presented sequentially. So first they showed them the risks, then they took away the risks, and then they showed them the benefits, and they took that away as well. Then they showed them the risks and benefits side by side or in separate pages, but at the same time, so that they're actually looking at papers, and they see the risks, and they saw the benefits side by side. So the new product features appeared more attractive when subjects were able to see the risks presented in contrast to the benefits and vice versa. Either side by side or on separate pages, it didn't matter, but as long as they were able to see them both at the same time. So what does this mean from a content perspective? It means that you absolutely want to alert your prospects to the risks of their status quo, right? You definitely want to let them know that the ice is cracking under their feet and that they're in danger. But the thing is, you can't simply heighten their awareness of the risks and then wave at them and walk away, because that's fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and that's not what you're selling. What you want to be able to do with your content, whether it's through an infographic, whether it's through a piece of marketing material, whether it's on your website, is you want to show the contrast. You want to show the risk, but you also want to see them show them a path forward, because it's that path forward, that contrast, that is going to communicate the value to them. That make sense? Okay. All right. So what is the best way to communicate? What is the best way to communicate that contrast, communicate that comparison? You need to make your message concrete. Here's the thing about the old brain. The human brain is not good with abstraction, right? It doesn't do abstraction really well. The human brain likes things that are simple, that are concrete, that are understandable. So if you're simply communicating value, that's not going to be enough to move the needle. And ironically, this is something that marketers have been trained to do their whole careers. How many of you have heard sell value, sell value, sell value, sell value, right? Like, you're still going to run across the stray marketer who's going to be messaging speeds and feeds and bits and bytes. But if you're in this room today, you know better than to do that. But what too many organizations have done is they've actually swung the pendulum too far in the opposite direction. And instead of talking about speeds and feeds and bits and bytes, they talk value propositions. So save time, save money, increase ROI. Highly abstract concepts that the brain has a really hard time wrapping itself around. What you're going to hear from corporate visions is not that you shouldn't talk about value, but what you need to do is you need to communicate your differentiation in the layer that lies between the feature and the benefit. And this is what we call the does level layer of messaging. When you can, the does, D-O-S-E, does level layer of messaging. If you can communicate your capabilities in a way that enables your prospect not just to envision some fluffy, abstract future world, but they can actually envision themselves concretely using your solution to achieve a desired result. And you can do this through case studies, through examples, through details, not details about your product, but details about your prospect's world and what that world actually looks like today and what it's going to look like tomorrow with your solution. If you can do that, if you can communicate that, then you're going to be on your way to communicating value with them. So what is the best way to communicate value to your prospects? What you're going to hear from corporate visions is that visuals, using a visual is one of the best, most effective ways to communicate that does level layer of messaging. In fact, our research shows that a subject is 65% more likely to remember your message if it is accompanied with a visual a day after they hear it than if they were not to get the visual at all. But the trick is, what kinds of visuals should you use? And I know you probably, those of you who are in the Monday session might have heard this as well. So we did do a study to find out what kind of selling visuals are most effective for customers. And actually, before I go there, I have a little quiz for you. Who can tell me who this is? This is a trick question, okay? This is Worried Businessman. Worried Businessman. Worried Businessman lives on iStock Photo. And Worried Businessman made an appearance when I was a marketer in every PowerPoint presentation I ever created. Sometimes he showed up as concerned executive. Sometimes he showed up as overwhelmed worker. Every now and then I liked to mix things up from a diversity perspective, and so I'd have a worried businesswoman pop up on a slide here and there. And if I really, really, really wanted to amp up the pain, I'd have a whole worried business team. So as I'm going through, poring over iStack, looking for the worried businessman and the worried business team and the overwhelmed workers and all this, what do you think my competition was doing? They're doing the same thing. And there's nothing more awkward, I tell you, when you see a competitor's piece of collateral and it's got the same stock photo that you used. So, stock photos, not a good way to differentiate yourself, right? So if you were to, so what a lot of organizations have done in response to that is that they've actually gone in the complete opposite direction, and they don't use the stock photos anymore. They use what we call Zen Imaging, like really pretty, peaceful, uplifting visuals that are supposed to evoke a certain feeling with you, but in the most part, just look really pretty. They look really pretty, and they make your presentations look a little bit differently. But again, when everybody else is using Zen photos, how differentiated are you, right? So, what kind of mess? Yes. Yes. Same thing. I mean, it's the same thing, right? Worried employee, worried objective, worried anything. Yeah, it's exactly. Well, so that's a little bit different. And it depends on what the context of your presentation is going to be. But if you're showing them pictures of their coworkers or their colleagues or something like that that they can relate to, you're using the photos in a different context. And as you saw before, context actually really does make a difference. So I think it depends on the nature of the presentation, but that's a great question. All right. Yeah, as long as they stay with you, exactly. Okay, all right, so Zen, again. So what is the most effective way to message? You've heard this. We actually did a study on this. Okay, so we gave prospects a message, and we presented it in 3 different visual ways. Bullets and stock photography. Worried executive, worried businessman made an appearance in this, right? That was scenario number 1. Scenario number 2, the Zen Condition, you know, an iceberg and, you know, that whole thing. And then a whiteboard style visual as well. Simple, hand-drawn, concrete images. And guess what we found out? Simple, concrete visuals win mind share every single time with a 16% improvement in memory, right? So, great. Again, we're marketers. We're dancing backward in high heels. You cannot go out and present a whiteboard to every single prospect that you want to engage with, right? But what you can do, and what you should do, and what I beg you to do, is to try to make your visuals your own. Make them unique. Simple. Arrows, lines, boxes, iconography, something that looks remarkably yours. Because again, remember, you're engaging with prospects who have brains, and those brains are looking for anomalies in the environment. So what you want to be sure to do is you want to make sure that you engage them in a different way than your prospects are engaging with them. And you look like you have a question. Yes? Oh, okay. Okay, great. All right. So I don't know how much time I have left, but I'm going to finish up, and then I am going to open up the floor for questions. But before I do that, there's a video that I share at the end of all the trainings that I do. And I'm going to share it with you because I think it's a really powerful video. But before I share the video, one of the things I just want to say is that our marketers, our world has been disrupted as well, right? We have gone from a world where we used to get 25-page glossy brochures to tell our stories, to where now we have to communicate our story in a 140-character tweet. We're constantly getting pressured to say it short, to say it, nobody cares about the story. What you just need to do is basically communicate what you need to communicate and then move on. And so it becomes really easy to get cynical in this environment. It becomes really easy to kind of get a little bit not bitter, but to really feel like the stories that you tell don't really matter. Yes and yes. So actually both, and it really depends on how your group is organized, and where you are with your stories. I would say that have an effective story is the most important thing. How you communicate. A whiteboard is a tool. A whiteboard is simply an asset. The whiteboard is not the story in and of itself. So how you tell that story is going to change depending on the nature of the interaction that you're having, whether it's a sales interaction, whether or not it's a marketing interaction. So at the end of the day, your salespeople still need to be situationally fluent enough to be able to deliver a whiteboard and to be able to adapt it and make it their own for a face-to-face conversation. But at the same time, you want to keep that core integrity of your story intact, because it's the story that is going to be the most effective. So, you know, some of the training tools that you could potentially do is you could do a live training to, you know, train them on the fundamentals of how to have an effective whiteboard conversation. But you can also feed them or seed them the story that they should be whiteboarding as well. And as they become more fluent and as they go through the process, they're going to get more confident, and they're going to be able to turn that whiteboard from a presentation into a conversation. Yeah. Does that answer the question? It does, yeah. Okay. All right. Yes. Okay, so the question is, what is does level messaging? So that's a great question. One of the ways to think about it, and I'll borrow from my power positioning library, is you think about your messages as having 3 different levels. We call it the is, the does, and the means. So the is the feature, right? That's the thing. That is the feature, that is the product, that is the capability that you are trying to sell. The means is the benefit. That's the benefit that you get from it. Cost savings, time savings, whatever is the result of applying that. The does, or what we actually like to say is the do. The do is what your prospect can do with that capability. What can they do differently? So not necessarily save money, because that's a result, but what is it that they need to do? How do they apply this capability to their environment to be able to achieve the desired result? So that's what the does level messaging is. It's what your prospect can do differently with your solution that they can't do with anyone else's. Think of it almost like as an example or a use case, something like that. Like how do they apply that capability? Okay, great question. Yes. So you definitely do. So, in corporate visions and power messaging, we have this concept of the value wedge. If anybody's familiar with the value wedge, which is, capabilities you offer that are unique to you, and important to the customer, and then defensible against the competition. And sometimes you don't have a value wedge. Sometimes all you have is value sliver. You might not have any differentiation, but what you actually do have is a differentiated way to tell the story. And sometimes, sometimes if you can be the one to open the prospect's eyes and get them to look at their world a little bit differently, they're going to look at your capabilities differently as well, because you're the one who brought the insight. You're the one who alerted them to something that was different in their environment. If you can be the one to do that, that's called sketching a buying vision. And research from Forrester Research shows that decision makers are 74% more likely to want to work with a company that establishes a buying vision than one who just competes on features and price. Yeah. So sometimes just the act of bringing an insight differentiates you. And sometimes you can take a single feature and a single capability, and you can combine it with other features and capabilities that are different from you. And that's constructing a solution, and that way you're differentiating that one feature in the context of your overall solutions. Yeah, great question. Other questions? So I have two answers for that. As a marketer, I would say that you do want to maintain governance over insights and how insights are used. For the reason that I talked about earlier, the way organizations sometimes bungle insights is, you tell salespeople, hey, just share a bunch of insights, share bunch of facts with your customers. They will go out and they will bombard your customers with facts till the cows come home. And sometimes enough just like having a percentage. They will go out and they will blurt that out to a customer, and then they'll get lost when they actually try to put that insight into context. So I do think that it's important to be able to maintain governance over insights and how they get used and which insights are used. But because the last thing in the world you want to do is to come up with an insight or a stat that actually was generated by a competitor, or that is really old, or that is not valid. So there's lots of really credible reasons why you want to maintain governance over insights. But I'll go back to what the way I answered the question earlier as well, which is that you do want your salespeople to be situationally fluent enough to be able to use insights as they need to further those conversations. So it's not an either-or thing, it's a little bit of both thing. It's a little bit of both. I mean, so I actually am not a PowerPoint hater. I am a stock photography hater, as you might possibly have guessed. But I'm not a PowerPoint hater because I think that there are times that you need to present complex ideas and schematics and things like that. And PowerPoint, when you get further into the why you conversation, PowerPoint can be an effective way to communicate those things. But for initial conversation, for communicating insights, for communicating a point of view, simpler, concrete visuals are better. And they're better, number one, because they're easier for the brain to grasp and make sense of, but also because they are different from what other people are presenting as well. I mean, you think about it, again, the old brain being wired to recognize anomalies. If you are vendor number 5 in one of those parade of vendor presentations that you're going into a prospect, you go into that conference room, you're number 5, they've already seen 4 presentations, the lights go down, the PowerPoint comes up, the old brain of your prospects is going to take one look at that and be like, yep, nope, see, there's nothing to see here, and it's going to shut down. So you do want to mix it up. You want to do things that are startling and that are different, and whiteboarding is definitely one way to do something different.